All right. Hermes Cabral from UC Davis. I have a question for you, Ty. So using the global burden of disease database to come up with a healthy diet. Do you have any opinion on that?
Sorry, can you elaborate?
So some of the way in which we talk about what is a healthy diet, what is, how much of different food groups that we should consume. There are different databases out there. So one of them is just looking at the disease burden. And so do you think that's the right way to approach healthy diet, or we should be looking into more the requirements approach?
I think we need both. The limitations of the GBD, or the global burden of disease study, is that there's very little data that's being used. So for example, if you're looking at the health burden of micronutrient deficiencies, there's a very small amount. I mean, previous versions, I think calcium was the only micronutrient that was considered. And so the modeling is only as good as the data that we have. And there are some big limitations. The GBD has not incorporated the latest evidence on actual biomarkers of deficiency in their models. So I think we're underestimating the role of micronutrients. The health risk, I think it's all over the place. So if you look at the GBD 2017 study, which came out in 2019, for example, unprocessed red meat, the target value was 22 grams, where anything above that threshold was considered a health burden for morbidity and mortality. And then 2 years later, the 2019 GBD came out and published in, I think, 2021. They reduced that to 0 grams was the threshold. And so if you have 1 gram of unprocessed red meat, there was a measurable morbidity and mortality, and it was supposed to be based on these systematic reviews. There was a lot of pushback, I think, understandably. And eventually, the authors published a paper recently looking at the health risk and kind of changing course to say, oh, well, actually, we were wrong. There's actually a moderate amount of red meat that can be beneficial. So I think there's major limitations in the modeling. When we look at the nutrient gaps in some of these diets, like, for example, the Eat Lancet diet, we see shortfalls as well. So I think we need a more holistic approach where we look at what are the recommended intakes for targets, as well as looking at some of the non-communicable disease burden risks.
Great. If any of the other speakers too ever want to chime in on a question, please do. All right, Luis, you have a question?
Yes. Okay, Luis Tedeschi from Texas A&M. It's was really nice, those talks. And my question goes, I think, directly to Dr. Place, Sarah, and Frank. I also would like to hear this. So I think we discussed, you presented the net zero concept, and that's my question related to net zero. I have some concerns, or I think we need to be more aware, or at least discuss more about what net zero really means. My concern is net zero will keep the system the way it is. Of course, we have the inertia of the system. For some point in time, we're still going to increase temperature, CO2, whatever greenhouse gas we're talking about. And then after some time, then we're going to plateau. That's the concept of net zero, because the release is zero. So the system will plateau at some point in time. I think we need to start thinking about it, as I mentioned before, a sub-zero or something negative right now, because if we don't start removing, if the net is not negative, then the system will achieve a plateau for some point in time, after some point in time, and plateau. Whereas if we go on a net negative or sub-zero system, then it will still going up for some point, we'll reach a peak, and then we'll start declining. And then at that point, we should think about net zero. So my question is about that, some comments about this from you. What is your thinking about that? And the other thing is, we're promising a lot that net zero is going to solve the problem. And we'll see that if we really get net zero, we will reach a plateau it won't go down. So that is my comment question. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent question. So if we look at the actual IPCC, right, the special report on 1.5 degrees, or the latest reports that have come out, right, to clarify, when we think about net zero, it really is about these temperature goals, right? And that's where the Paris Climate Accord is worded, right, about trying to stay within 2 degrees Celsius. So to clarify, yes, if we achieve that goal and we hit, 1.8 or a little over 2 degrees C, that's the goal, is to just maintain that above pre-industrial times, right? If you look at other scenarios, right, even with that goal, net zero will be very hard to achieve, because there's kind of this realization, you'd always have to offset residual, if you will, emissions with CO2 sequestration or drawdown, right? And that part is really hard. So to your point, Luis, yes, even hitting net zero or going beyond that, and the idea of trying to reverse warming, and then as we discussed in the hall, right, the Earth system working against you there, because if you start drawing down CO2, you're probably going to get off gassing from the oceans and everything else. That becomes very difficult, right? So, but I think that is a good clarification, that net zero doesn't mean things go back to where they were. It just means you try to stop warming. So that's a very good clarification from that standpoint. And obviously it looks different depending on what gas we're talking about. But the challenge is very great. And I think that question of drawdown, that's the part that gets really sticky and very difficult, right? Of how do you actually achieve that, let alone just stop emitting a net of 40 plus gigatons of CO2 every single year, right?
Well, I'm not a fan of net zero. The term net zero is so vague. It means so many different things to different people. To me, what it's all about is we don't want to add additional warming. First, we don't want to add additional warming. So to me, climate neutrality, or if you want to call it net zero warming, is a first step to achieve. And we can achieve that through strong reductions of methane because of the unique nature of methane. That is the first step. We can reduce methane, and once we do, we can offset nitrous oxide and CO2, which are sometimes unavoidable. But we shouldn't stop there. We should go beyond that. And if we do, then we in animal agriculture can become part of a climate solution, because methane is our main greenhouse gas. And when we reduce it, we can reduce warming. So, and that gives us really a very unique place in this whole discussion around climate. This is not, and I want everybody to be very clear about this, this is not some kind of creative accounting or greenwashing or so, but because of the nature of methane, and because that being our main gas, if we reduce that gas strongly enough by 30, 40 or more %, then we will have a profound impact on climate. And we should encourage our farmers to get there. And it is our role to help them to get there.
Great. Next.
Hi, Jessica Gordon from Michigan State. I love Frank. I'm like a I fangirl Frank all the time, but I love Sarah too. So I think this stuff is so interesting in terms of just decreasing the global warming, right? It's obviously really important. My concern with some of these additives and stuff is just that holistic approach. And I think, Sarah, you were saying that's sort of what you're doing at CSU. So coming from a veterinary side, we can add things which either impact health, which then leads to your 40% loss, right, in pigs in China, or we can increase the time it takes for our feedlot animals to finish. And then sometimes we get really focused on the daily methane, but if those animals are 40 more days in the feedlot, then their overall methane is a lot higher. So is there a push in this area to include all those, to include death loss in feedlot, to include increased time, all those sort of things in the new research that's occurring?
Yeah, great question. So yes, to your answer your last question there, thinking about all those things at once has to take place, right? Because if we did only focus, to your point, of reducing methane per animal, right, we could get a whole bunch of unintended consequences if we don't think about the system. And so I think later you're going to hear more in depth about life cycle assessment, right? And those kind of approaches, or more even from a bigger picture, like a whole system, general equalized kind of modeling type approaches are needed to think about that, because you have to consider total production, right? Emissions in total, right? And that point I was trying to make about intensity reductions are good, but then you also have to think about the absolute that you're emitting, right? Back to this point about reducing total emissions. So, and that piece is very important, where we draw the boundaries of our analysis, right? Because I think we can have different answers depending upon where our system boundaries are. And I'll pick on California a bit, right? This whole herd reduction, I will pick on that herd reduction as reducing methane from California. Those cows just moved to Texas. Let's be real, right? They did not go away, right? So that part, like, I think we have to have like our true like metric is, what is the atmospheric concentration of these gases? That at the end of the day is what matters. And what we're doing to that bigger picture system is, what's the atmospheric concentration? Are we nourishing people properly? Are we depleting water, right? We have to always ground truth what we're doing in that bigger picture perspective.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, so first of all, leakage is a real problem. Okay, leakage meaning that you take animals away from one place and you just put them someplace else. That's not what I was alluding to in my comments there, though. But I just wanted to say that. So, but with respect to which buttons to push there, it's not one or the other. There's really no benefit in just focusing on one approach, let's say feed additives or manure management or so. It is a combination of all of the above. We have to continue to improve efficiencies, particularly in those areas of the world where efficiencies are terrible, where they are really, really low. We have to think about all parts of the life cycle of producing these products, including, but not just limited to, enteric, manure, feed production. It's the whole thing. The bottom line is we have to reduce emissions. And if we do, then we can achieve really great results. And the rest is just politics and activism and so on. And we need to get away from that.
Great. Joel, you had a next question?
Sure enjoyed the presentations very much. Questions, Sarah, for you and some for you, Ty, because they kind of link together. I really appreciated the way you handled the data in relation to the nutrient density of animal products compared with most plant products. And my question is in those calculations, you've worked with nutrient density, but if you added an increased bioavailability that's associated with the animal products, as Ty discussed in your discussion of modeling those comparable animal footprints versus plant footprints.
Yeah, so just that human edible protein return, not just considering all crude protein to be equal versus actually thinking about the bioavailability and amino acid composition, that does make that ratio look even better typically for ruminant production, right? When you account for the protein score, whatever may be the metric. But I think that's a great example of, sometimes show that of like it. You could say feed conversion efficiency. You can express feed conversion efficiency 3 different ways and get 3 different answers about what animal is the most efficient, right? So it just, that's part of that discussion of keeping our eye on the North Star of what's important, right? To the point of hopefully nutritional adequacy, right? Going back to Ermias's question of like making sure people have enough of the right kind of foods in all the different cultural contexts is hopefully why we're all here, right? To achieve that first.
Yeah, I'll just add that what we would be talking about is a nutritional functional unit in the life cycle analysis. So if you have a marker of, say, a quantity of protein, if you adjust for protein quality, animal source foods look better. If you're doing micronutrient density, animal source foods look better. But there's a lot of opinions about what should the functional unit be. Should you factor in non-communicable disease risk? How do you quantify that? plant source foods can score well in that way, right? You can look at fiber content and whatnot. So I think it's a question, it's very underexplored, but it's a new area where nutritionists are working with environmental scientists to figure out how do you better quantify a nutritional value of a food, because I think different groups want to say, look, this is better because if you look at it from this angle, it has this value. This is better for this value. I think it's a topic that needs to be debated and discussed.
Great question there.
Hi, my name is Atikur Rahman. I'm a master's student from the University of New Hampshire. I'm originally from Bangladesh, so this is a nice presentation. So my question is for Dr. Place and Dr. Mitlaner. Since the US and all the European countries already putting a lot of work and funding to reduce the like methane emission from cows or beef cows or dairy cows, but the other part of the world, since you mentioned like we have like 10 million cows in the US and the India itself has like 50 million cows. So how can the developed countries help them achieve, like I haven't seen any methane emission study from India or from Bangladesh or from Pakistan, and like especially in Southeast Asia. So we are putting a lot of work to reduce methane emission in one part, and the another part is like their methane emission is increasing. So like how we can help them achieve to go like gain the goal and to reduce their emission, or how can we help them to start even like doing the methane emission work?
I think this is a critical question. Two countries of the world, India and Brazil, have more cattle than the rest of the world combined. If we do not place some focus on areas like that and help them achieve better environmental and other, nutritional outcomes, then that is a huge missed opportunity. It is extremely important, and I hope that came out clear in my comments that we have to have. In my opinion, we have to have a new green revolution, okay, and really direct global capacity into working with developing and emerging countries to improve food production, to improve nutrition, because if that doesn't help, if that won't occur, then we will just have things falling on our feet. So absolutely. So I do agree. We do need to help those countries install veterinary systems, improve nutrition of animals, help them to develop appropriate breeds, both for feeding and crops on the one side, but also animals. It is absolutely essential that we do that.
Yep. And just building upon that, I think those aspects that Frank mentioned, right? Sometimes it's more starting with the basics of the reinvestment in those agricultural systems, right? We're lucky here in the developed world where we've had tremendous investment and reinvestment into our animal agricultural system. So we've able to develop how we have, right? And I think that example of Brazil is a great one where they basically have twice as many cattle, but yet still make less beef than the United States, right? And so that opportunity gap, a lot of it is honestly even doing things like improving reproductive rates, right? And thinking about it from that perspective will have a huge impact on total animals required, right, to produce protein. And then hopefully the research that we do for additives eventually will also be able to translate, right, to ruminants in other parts of the world.
Yeah, it's kind of like a luxury because in Bangladesh, like thousands of people are dying every day for the protein deficiency disease. So it's kind of a luxury to reduce methane emission and put funding for that kind of work. Yeah, thank you for your opinion.
Thank you. Question.
Hi, Jacqueline Prestegard, Texas A&M. My question is maybe Dr. Mitlerner can speak on this, is how, and maybe more importantly, who should be advising our producers on decisions related to carbon markets, entering the carbon space, I suppose, because my concern is anytime there is an opportunity to profit or make money, there's also an opportunity for exploitation. And I just want to, as somebody who works in extension, I want to know how and who should be guiding our producers in entering these markets and making sure that the best decisions are being made for them, and also that so we can move forward in our sustainability efforts.
Thank you for giving me the absolute most difficult question. I would say there's a wild west out there right now on this whole front of carbon crediting and offsetting and so on. There's really no harmonized way that I can see that we have a system here in the United States where you reduce emissions by X, Y, and then you receive some kind of a credit, or where we quantify emission reductions in any harmonized way and so on. It truly is a wild west. There are now some companies that do validate and so forth emission reductions, and there are some credits assigned to producers, but I think we are really at an early stage right now. If I were a producer and people would offer me some credits for whatever I do, I'd be very, very standoffish at this point, because we don't really know how it plays out. We just don't know how it plays out, and whether or not credits that I receive today will then preclude me from getting credits in the future. The whole issue around additionality is driving me a little bit insane, and I know I'm not alone. And additionality means that if you, let's say, have done something that is considered a good practice for the last 10 years, and now comes a deadline by which everybody has to do it, then you who has done it for the last 10 years will get no credit for it. But only the people who are starting it today will get credit for it. That makes no sense. You explain that to a farmer, they will all just revolt over this. So we have to have, I think, much more of a harmonized approach around this issue that you are alluding to there, and a better way of quantifying reductions and validating those and so on. Currently, we don't have them. What do you think about this, Sarah?
Yeah, I think the role that extension plays is going to be increasingly important, right? Because there's a lot of people trying to take an angle on this, and everybody wants a piece of that price, right? So I think the role of universities is going to be even more important as this wild west keeps kind of shaking out, right? And I think the other thing is currently carbon prices, in my opinion, are far too low for any of this to work, right? So even that theoretical $50 I put up on the slide, we're nowhere near close to that in voluntary markets, right? It's like $3 to $5. The California offset market's higher, right? Because you have actually cap and trade, but there's really no enteric market yet in that state. And I think that's important because if you do the math, like a feed additive that costs, 15, 20 cents per cow per day, say on a dairy, like carbon price got to be like $70 before that makes sense, right? If you do the math on it. And so I think that's the part where there's a disconnect currently. And I worry, one, of the carbon accounting piece of it, and two, to the point of like the exploitation question that you brought up, given that all these net zero commitments, whatever they mean, are out there and companies are feeling a lot of pressure, I think there will be a lot of pressure, and there already is, to tell producers what to do and to feed a certain thing or use a certain technology. And it's a bit provocative, but to me, that's kind of like stealing, right? Because you're requiring somebody to create a new asset, a methane reduction, and then you just assume you're going to take it from them, right? And so I think that's part of that whole conversation that needs to happen too, is just the clarity on what are we buying and selling. And I think there's a risk if the emissions reduction becomes tied to products, then this becomes a gatekeeping exercise of you either have to do this or you're not going to be able to market your cattle, your milk, your hogs to me, right? Versus an opportunity, right? That approach of a voluntary incentive-based, right? And that's where it does get to be more political and philosophical than science-based.
Yeah, I think you guys hit the nail on the head. So thank you.
Thank you. Question.
Yeah, Ira Parsons from South Dakota State University. I just had a quick question, kind of spurred on by Dr. Tedeschi's comment about, like future warming. And, like, I think we recognize that a certain amount of change is already baked into the cake, just because we've, where we're at today, and then how long it's going to take just the economy to settle in. So what is the role of, like, number one, like, developing, what technologies do we need to be looking for to develop resilient ag systems that can really accomplish change or adapt to the change? Because I think we recognize that, it's probably going to be very beneficial for some areas of the world and less beneficial for others. And also to, like, what do we need to be thinking about as scientists, that the technologies we don't develop or the market inputs that we do don't have an unintended consequence of actually reducing the reliability of our food systems. And I'd ask the panel the question, and not directed at any one particular speaker.
I guess I'll start and we can go down the line. So yes, 100%. I think simultaneous, we're talking about mitigation, but we also have to be thinking about adaptation and to the point of resilience, the ability to deal with shocks to the system, right? And all those things have to happen at the same time, right? And they're all pretty underinvested in at the same time, right? So classically, of course, we can think about heat stress as a direct effect, and especially in North America. And obviously, in some cases with livestock production systems or more controlled environments, there's kind of ways to deal with that. We think about cattle production, right? A bigger challenge of just the lack of shade, right? In feedlots. And I know Frank has worked on this for decades, right? Of just trying to get shade in feedlots seems to be difficult sometimes, but those type of things are what we have to think about. I think the broader system and water availability is something that's also a huge challenge. And that's where, again, we could get wrapped around the axle if we only focus on the carbon emission side of things and don't think about water availability and how that impacts the total availability of feedstuffs. Where should we be, growing alfalfa, right? Maybe not in certain regions where we currently are, right? Those type of things are the bigger system questions I think we had to tackle.
Yeah, different parts of the agricultural enterprise have different means of responding and adapting to climate change. So, for example, an intensive dairy or a feedlot or so has it easier versus a extensive ranch. Why? Because you have access to those animals several times a day. You are feeding them. That means now you can apply feed additives, or you have access to their manure. You can cap the lagoon, as I said, or you can scrape it out of the corrals and compost it, and you can do things with it. But I get many questions when traveling to Australia, New Zealand, to Ireland, to those places where animals are under extensive conditions, and there the options are more limited because you don't have access to those animals every day, and you are not collecting the manure. So there, the approaches might be more on the genetic front, or maybe you can take some active ingredients and manufacture them into some kind of salt lick, or maybe in some kind of drinking water, or maybe vaccines will become available, but it's much more difficult. But this is really a sector that must be worked upon because it is so important globally. The extensive agricultural enterprise is massive globally, and we can't just neglect that. We have to address that aggressively.
I'll just add one thing, that the people who are going to be impacted the most are the poor people in Africa and South Asia who don't have as much capacity to adapt to this resilience. So I think we need a lot of effort to address that and support their efforts.
I have to add, insects are adapted to every climate. So it's a good starting point to think about.
I know we're out of time, but I'll take one last question from the floor. So go ahead, Robin.
I have a cellular agriculture question. So hopefully we'll spread our love out among our speakers here. Thank you so much for sharing the exciting information about that topic. As a nutritionist, I think of this challenge of feeding the world very much as a global mass balance challenge. And so I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about the mass balance in the cellular agriculture space. So things like the nutrient use efficiency, the profile of nutrients needed to culture these cells, and what types of nutrient transformations occur maybe in non-GMO systems versus the types of GMO systems that you alluded to at the end.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's very little information yet to base anything on because it's such a nascent field. So I can only say nutritionally, very limited documented studies to date. I can tell you we only recently got IRB approval to have our students smell and taste our own foods that we grow in the lab this way. Companies that are doing this don't divulge what they've done to any degree, so we don't know. So it's an open, kind of the Wild West, as you said, for the other, carbon credits and so on. It's the same thing. We don't know enough yet. That's part of the reason it's really important for at least the university side to do the studies and publish the work for transparency. You can hand wave, which for the sake of doing it, we will, that the cells and the composition should be no different than what you see in an animal in principle. The only real difference, which I alluded to, is that you have more direct access to those cells. So in principle, you can enhance nutrition, but there's no documentation of that yet at a scale that's meaningful. So I would say stay tuned. And I think we're all aware of that need. I can tell you our large USDA program, one of the key elements there is nutritional assessments and safety, and that's ongoing. But there's not a lot of, hard data yet to give you a good answer, but thank you. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great. Great questions, great answers, great speakers. Let's thank our morning speakers very much. Thank you, guys.